The mining drill screamed against the asteroid's surface as sparks flew in all directions. David wiped sweat from his forehead and checked the temperature gauge one more time. The equipment was running too hot again, just like it had been for the past 3 weeks. He grabbed his toolkit and crawled under the massive machine, looking for the source of the problem. Working alone on mining station Omega-7 wasn't supposed to be dangerous. The automated systems handled most of the heavy work while David maintained the equipment and made sure everything ran smoothly. It was boring work, but it paid well and gave him plenty of time to read and think. Most people would go crazy from the isolation, but David found peace in the steady rhythm of machines and the quiet of deep space. The drill's housing was cracked again. David sighed and reached for his welding torch. This was the 5th time this month he'd had to patch the same spot. The company kept promising to send replacement parts, but they never seemed to arrive. He'd learned to make do with whatever materials he could salvage from the station's storage rooms. As he worked, David noticed something strange. The asteroid they were mining had an unusual crystalline structure that seemed to bend light in impossible ways. Every time he looked directly at it, the crystal appeared to shift and change color. The mining reports had mentioned some odd mineral compositions, but nothing like this. He was still welding when the first crack appeared in space itself. David blinked and shook his head, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the crack was still there, a thin line of absolute darkness cutting through the air about 10 feet away. It looked like someone had drawn a line with a marker that absorbed all light. As he watched, the crack began to widen. The station's emergency alarms started blaring. David's tablet lit up with warnings he'd never seen before. Spatial distortion detected. Gravitational anomaly increasing. Recommend immediate evacuation. But there was nowhere to evacuate to. The nearest ship wouldn't arrive for another 6 months. The crack in space grew larger, revealing a swirling vortex of colors that hurt to look at. David felt a pulling sensation, as if the air itself was being sucked toward the opening. He grabbed onto the drill's support frame and held on as loose tools and debris began flying toward the tier. In reality, the pull grew stronger. David's feet left the ground as his grip on the metal frame started to slip. He reached for his emergency tether, but it was too late. The vortex grabbed him and pulled him through the crack in space before he could even scream. The sensation of falling through the void lasted both forever and no time at all. David tumbled through streams of light and shadow, past structures that looked like buildings made of crystallized music and forests of geometric trees that sang in mathematical harmonies. He saw glimpses of beings that seemed to be made of pure energy, their forms shifting between states of matter as they observed his passage with what might have been curiosity. When he finally stopped falling, David found himself standing on a platform made of what looked like solidified starlight. The surface felt solid under his feet, but when he looked down he could see galaxies spinning slowly beneath the transparent material. Around him stretched an enormous arena with seats that rose up into infinity, filled with beings that defied description. Some looked almost human but were clearly made of living metal that flowed like water. Others appeared to be shifting clouds of gas and electricity that somehow maintained recognizable shapes. A few seemed to exist in multiple dimensions, at once, their forms flickering between different versions of themselves. All of them were looking at David with expressions that ranged from amusement to disdain. In the center of the arena sat 3 judges on thrones that appeared to be carved from compressed time itself. They were ancient beyond comprehension, their forms shifting between different states of existence as they spoke in voices that echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. "A human," said the first judge, its voice carrying the sound of stars being born. "How unexpected." "Barely evolved," added the second, whose words felt like the heat death of the universe. "Still bound by the limitations of flesh?" The third judge studied David with eyes that contained swirling galaxies. "The tournament of the gods has very simple rules, little creature. Any being who enters the arena must compete or face immediate obliteration. There are no exceptions." David looked around at the other competitors and felt his stomach drop. These weren't just powerful beings, they were forces of nature given consciousness. The creature nearest to him seemed to be made of the space between atoms, while another appeared to be a living representation of the concept of motion itself. How was he supposed to compete against gods? "I didn't mean to enter," David said, his voice sounding tiny in the vast arena. "I was just fixing a drill when intent is irrelevant," the first judge interrupted. "You are here. You will compete. The tournament has already begun." One of the competitors, a being that looked like a human-shaped constellation, laughed with the sound of solar wind. "This should be entertaining. I am called the Void Walker, and I have consumed entire solar systems. What exactly do you think? You can do against us, little human?" Another competitor, whose form seemed to be constantly creating and destroying small universes, nodded in agreement. "I am the world shaper. I have rebuilt reality itself according to my will. You should surrender now and accept a quick obliteration." David clutched his toolkit, the familiar weight of his tools providing some small comfort in this impossible situation. He thought about the asteroid he'd been mining, with its strange, crystalline structure that bent light in ways that shouldn't be possible. Maybe the key to surviving this wasn't to match their power, but to understand something they didn't. "I guess we'll find out," David said quietly. The judges raised their hands and reality began to shift around them. The first trial was about to begin, and David had no idea how a simple maintenance engineer was supposed to survive a competition between gods. But he'd spent his whole life figuring out how broken things worked and finding ways to fix them with whatever tools he had available. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe being human was exactly what this tournament needed. The arena transformed around them as the first trial began. David watched in amazement as the solid platform beneath their feet dissolved into a swirling mass of raw creative energy. The three judges gestured with hands that seemed to be made of condensed reality, and suddenly each competitor stood in their own sphere of potential. "The trial of creation," announced the first judge. "You must create something that demonstrates your understanding of existence itself. You have until the cosmic cycle completes." David looked up to see a massive clock floating in the void above them, its hands moving in patterns that hurt his brain to follow. He had no idea how long a cosmic cycle might be, but judging by the speed of the clock's movement, it wouldn't be very long. Around him, the other competitors immediately began their work. The Void Walker raised its arms and pulled matter from the space between dimensions, weaving it into a structure that looked like a living galaxy. Stars formed and died within its creation as entire civilizations rose and fell in the span of seconds. The world shaper began even more dramatically, reaching into the fundamental forces of reality and pulling them apart like clay. David watched in terror and fascination as the being crafted an entire pocket universe, complete with its own laws of physics that defied everything he thought he knew about how the cosmos worked. The eternal flame, whose body seemed to be made of the same fire that powered stars, created a living symphony of energy that sang across multiple dimensions. Its creation existed as both music and matter, a perfect fusion of art and science that made David's eyes water just to look at it. David stared at his own sphere of creative energy and felt completely lost. How was he supposed to compete with beings who could casually create universes? He reached into his toolkit and pulled out a simple wrench, feeling foolish even as he did it, but then he remembered the asteroid he'd been mining. Its strange crystalline structure had been beautiful precisely because it was simple and functional. Maybe that was the key. While the gods were showing off their power, perhaps he could show them something they'd forgotten. David began to work with the creative energy, but instead of trying to make something grand and impossible, he focused on making something small and useful. He crafted a simple mechanical device no bigger than his fist, with gears and springs that moved in perfect harmony. It wasn't flashy or impressive, but it had one special property: it could repair itself. When the cosmic cycle completed, the judges examined each creation. They spent long minutes studying the Voidwalker's living galaxy, nodding in approval as they watched civilizations evolve and transcend physical existence. They marveled at the World Shaper's pocket universe, testing its unique physics with obvious delight, then they came to David's small device. The three ancient beings stared at it for a long moment, and David was sure he was about to be obliterated for creating something so pathetic compared to the others. "Interesting," said the second judge finally. "Self-repair? We had not considered that approach." "It demonstrates understanding of entropy," added the third judge. "Most beings focus on creating, but this one has created something that creates itself." The first judge picked up David's device and examined it closely. Simple, elegant, functional. "When did we last see such honesty in creation?" David couldn't believe it when they declared his creation worthy to advance to the next trial. The other competitors stared at him with expressions that were no longer amused. The Void Walker's constellation form flickered with what might have been irritation. The second trial was the trial of destruction. The arena filled with targets made of crystallized concepts, physical representations of ideas like hope, fear, love, and hatred. The competitors were supposed to destroy them completely. The Void Walker immediately began consuming the targets, devouring them so thoroughly that they ceased to exist in any form. The World Shaper unraveled their fundamental structure, reducing them to their component particles and then destroying those as well. The Eternal Flame burned them out of existence with fire hot enough to melt the fabric of SPACET. David looked at his assigned target, a crystal that seemed to represent the concept of curiosity. It pulsed with soft light and seemed almost alive. Instead of trying to destroy it like the others were doing, David sat down next to it and began to talk. "You know," he said quietly, "I've always been curious about things. That's what got me into engineering in the first place. I wanted to understand how things worked." The crystal pulsed brighter as if responding to his words. "But here's the thing about curiosity," David continued. "It's not really something you can destroy from the outside. It only goes away when it gets satisfied, when it finds the answers it's looking for." David reached into his toolkit and pulled out a small scanner he used for analyzing mineral compositions. He began showing the crystal how it worked, explaining each component and function. As he did, the crystal began to glow less brightly. "See, once you understand something completely," David said, "the curiosity about it naturally fades away. It doesn't need to be destroyed. It just completes itself." By the time he finished his explanation, the crystal had dissolved peacefully, its curiosity satisfied by the knowledge David had shared. The judges stared at him in what might have been shock. "He convinced it to destroy itself," whispered the first judge. "Through understanding rather than force," added the second. "Most unusual," concluded the third. The other competitors were no longer looking at David with amusement. The Void Walker's form had grown darker, while the World Shaper seemed to be studying David with genuine interest. The Eternal Flame burned a little less brightly. As if uncertain as they prepared for the third trial, David realized something important. He wasn't winning because he was more powerful than these cosmic beings. He was winning because he was thinking about the problems differently. They were so used to using their godlike abilities that they'd forgotten there might be other approaches. The thought was both encouraging and terrifying. If he was right, then maybe he actually had a chance to survive this tournament. But it also meant he was challenging beings who had probably never been challenged before, and David had a feeling they weren't going to like that very much. The Tournament of the Gods had never seen anything like what was happening. David could sense the confusion and growing concern among the cosmic judges as they prepared for the trial of time. The ancient beings who had overseen countless tournaments were finding their fundamental assumptions challenged by a simple human with a toolkit. The arena shifted again, becoming a vast chamber filled with flowing streams of temporal energy. Past, present, and future swirled around them in visible currents that sparkled with the light of countless possibilities. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of history and potential. "Navigate the temporal maze," commanded the first judge, its voice carrying echoes from multiple timelines. "Reach the center where all possibilities converge. Do not become lost in the streams of time, or you will cease to exist across all realities." The other competitors immediately began their assault on time itself. The Void Walker expanded its consciousness across multiple timelines simultaneously, using brute force to carve a path through the temporal currents. The World Shaper began rewriting the maze's structure, changing the flow of time to create shortcuts that defied causality. The eternal flame burned through temporal barriers, leaving trails of crystallized moments in its wake. David watched their approaches and felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of their power. These beings were manipulating time like he might adjust the settings on a machine. But as he studied the flowing currents more carefully, he began to notice something the others seemed to miss. The temporal streams weren't random, they had patterns. They flowed like rivers, following natural channels carved by the weight of cause and effect. Where the other competitors were fighting against these currents, David realized he might be able to work with them instead. He pulled out a small compass from his toolkit, one he'd modified years ago to detect magnetic fields in asteroid belts. But here in the temporal maze, the compass needle began spinning in patterns that seemed to track the flow of time itself. David smiled and began following the path of least resistance, where the Voidwalker's brute force approach created violent eddies in the time stream. David slipped through the natural gaps between moments. Where the World Shaper's reality bending left scars in causality, David found the gentle currents that connected past to future without disruption. Where the eternal flame's passage burned away possibilities, David discovered streams that preserved all potential outcomes. He reached the center of the maze first, arriving just as the other competitors were still battling their way through the temporal barriers they created for themselves. The judges stared at him with expressions that seemed to contain entire galaxies of confusion. "How?" asked the second judge. "You didn't fight the time stream," observed the third judge. "You read it, like following a map?" David nodded, still catching his breath. "Where I come from, we have rivers. You don't swim upstream if you don't have to. You learn to read the current and work with it instead of against it." The first judge leaned forward on its throne of crystallized time. "You speak as if time has ... natural properties. As if it follows rules, doesn't it?" David asked. "I mean, even with all your power, you can't make yesterday come after tomorrow. Right? There are still patterns. Still laws that everything has to follow, even God's." The silence that followed was the kind that made David wonder if he'd just said something very dangerous. The other competitors had finally reached the center of the maze, and they were staring at him with expressions that were no longer merely curious. "The human raises an interesting point," the World Shaper said, its voice carrying undertones of threat. "Perhaps it's time we reminded him of the difference between gods and mortals." The Voidwalker's constellation form grew darker. "I agree. This creature has been lucky so far, but luck runs out." They didn't wait for the next official trial. The two cosmic beings joined their power together, creating a prison of collapsed space-time around David. Reality folded in on itself, trapping him in a bubble where the normal laws of physics ceased to function. Inside the prison, up became down, matter became energy, and existence itself became negotiable. "Let's see you think your way out of this, little human," the Voidwalker sneered. But David wasn't panicking. Instead, he was studying the prison's structure with the same methodical approach he used when diagnosing a broken machine. The collapsed space-time wasn't random. It was being held together by the combined will and energy of his captors, which meant it had to follow certain patterns to remain stable. He pulled out his modified scanner and began taking readings. The device had never been designed to analyze impossible physics, but David had learned long ago that most problems could be broken down into simpler components if you looked at them the right way. The energy signatures were fascinating. The Voidwalker and World Shaper were pouring enormous amounts of power into maintaining the prison, but they were doing it inefficiently. They were using brute force where finesse would work better, creating stress points in the space-time structure. David reached into his toolkit and pulled out a simple multi-tool. He found one of the stress points and gave it a tiny adjustment, not trying to break the prison, just redistributing the forces slightly. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for his captors. The prison didn't just collapse, it inverted, turning their own power back on them. The Void Walker and World Shaper found themselves trapped in a bubble of their own making, their combined energies now working against them instead of for them. "Impossible," gasped the World Shaper. "You used our own power against us," the Void Walker said, its voice filled with something that might have been fear. David shrugged as he helped them out of their self-made prison. "Basic engineering principle. Every system has weak points. You just have to know where to look." The judges were no longer sitting casually on their thrones. They were leaning forward, studying David with an intensity that made the air around them crackle with barely contained energy. The third judge spoke. "First, you didn't overpower them. You didn't even really fight them. You found a flaw in their approach and exploited it," added the second judge. The first judge's voice carried a note of something David had never heard from a cosmic entity before. Uncertainty. "How do you keep doing this?" David thought about the question seriously. "I guess it's because I'm used to working with limitations. When you can't just force something to work, you have to understand why it's broken first. Then you find the simplest way to fix it." "Limitations," repeated the third judge as if the word was foreign. "You mean weakness?" the World Shaper said. Bitterly. "No," David said, shaking his head. "I mean understanding what's possible and what isn't. Even gods have to follow some rules, right? Otherwise, how would anything make sense?" The silence that followed was different from before. This time, David could sense that he'd said something that shook these ancient beings to their core. They were staring at him not with amusement or irritation, but with something approaching recognition. And for the first time since arriving in this impossible place, David began to suspect that maybe being human wasn't a disadvantage after all. The cosmic judges had retreated to a private chamber for the first time in millennia, leaving the competitors alone in the arena. David could see them through the translucent walls, their ancient forms flickering between different states of existence, as they engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Every few moments, one of them would gesture toward David, and the others would respond with movements that made the fabric of reality ripple. "You've done something unprecedented," the Eternal Flame said, its voice carrying the crackling energy of stellar fusion. Unlike the others, it didn't sound angry or threatened. Instead, there was something like curiosity in its tone. "I have existed since the first stars ignited, and I have never seen cosmic judges retreat to deliberate during a tournament." David was sitting cross-legged on the arena floor, carefully examining a small device he'd been constructing during each trial. To any observer, it looked like nothing more than a simple mechanical calculator made from scavenged tournament materials and held together with improvised fastenings. But David had been thinking about the fundamental nature of power itself, and his device was designed to test a theory that was growing stronger with each challenge. "I don't think I'm doing anything special," David said, making a tiny adjustment to one of the gears. "I'm just asking questions that seem obvious to me." The World Shaper's form shifted nervously. Since the incident with the space-time prison, the cosmic being had been studying David with a mixture of fascination and unease. "Your questions are dangerous, human. You're challenging assumptions that have stood for billions of years. Maybe they need to be challenged." David replied simply. The Void Walker's constellation form flickered with agitation. "You speak of limitations and rules as if they apply to us? We are beyond such things. We command reality itself." David looked up from his device. "Do you, though? I mean, really?" "Of course we do," the World Shaper snapped. "I have rebuilt entire galaxies according to my will." "But you rebuilt them using existing matter and energy, right?" David asked. "You didn't create them from nothing. You rearranged what was already there." The Eternal Flame's light dimmed slightly. "That is technically correct, but and when you consume solar systems," David continued, looking at the Void Walker, "where does all that matter and energy go? It doesn't just disappear?" "Conservation of mass and energy still applies, doesn't it?" The Void Walker's form grew darker. "You're oversimplifying. Our power transcends such basic concepts. Does it, though?" David held up his small device. "Because I've been calculating something while we've been competing. I've been measuring the energy you all use during these trials and comparing it to the actual work being accomplished. The other competitors fell silent. David activated his device, and its simple mechanical components began clicking and whirring as they processed calculations that would have challenged the most advanced computers humanity had ever built. The math is really interesting, David sighed, watching the results appear on his device's small display. You're all incredibly powerful, no doubt about that. But you're also incredibly inefficient. You use massive amounts of energy to accomplish things that could be done with a fraction of that power if you just approach the problems differently. The World Shaper's form began to fluctuate unstably. That's impossible. We are perfectly efficient expressions of cosmic will. Are you? David asked. Because according to my calculations, the amount of energy used to create that pocket universe in the first trial could have been used to create hundreds of similar universes if you'd worked with the existing quantum foam instead of trying to impose your will on it. The judges had stopped their discussion and were now watching through the chamber walls. David could sense their attention like a weight pressing down on the arena. And you, David said, looking at the Void Walker, when you consume matter, you're fighting against the natural bonds that hold atoms together. But if you understood those bonds better, you could convince the atoms to separate themselves willingly. Same result, but using about 1,000th of the energy. The eternal flame's light began to flicker erratically. You're suggesting we're wasteful? I'm suggesting you're so focused on demonstrating your power that you've forgotten about efficiency, David said. It's like using a sledgehammer to crack an egg. Sure, it works, but there are better ways. The cosmic judges emerged from their chamber, their expressions unreadable. The first judge's voice carried undertones that made the arena's walls vibrate. Human David, you have raised questions that strike at the heart of cosmic order itself. Hey. Didn't mean to cause problems? David said honestly. I was just trying to understand how things work. That, said the second judge, is precisely the problem. You are asking us to justify our authority based on logical principles rather than accepting it as absolute truth. The third judge stepped forward. For eons, we have ruled through power. Our authority came from our ability to impose our will on reality. But you suggest that true authority should come from understanding. David nodded. Where I come from, the best leaders aren't the ones who can force people to do things. They're the ones who understand why those things need to be done and can explain it in a way that makes sense. Preposterous, the World Shaper declared, but its voice lacked conviction. Is it? David asked. Look at what's happening right now. Your powers are becoming unstable because you're starting to question the assumptions they're based on. The Void Walker is discovering that you can't have true emptiness without something to contrast it against. The World Shaper is realizing that infinite creation requires infinite responsibility. The Eternal Flame is learning that real eternity means accepting change, not preventing it. As if responding to his words, the other competitors' forms began to shift and change. Their godlike abilities, which had seemed so absolute and unchanging, were now fluctuating as they grappled with new understanding. This is what I've been calculating, David said, holding up his device again. The mathematical probability that power without understanding can remain stable over infinite time periods. He pressed a button and the device displayed its final result. The number that appeared was so simple that even the cosmic judges could understand it immediately. 0. Your system is unsustainable, David said quietly. It always has been. You've just been too powerful to notice the cracks in the foundation. The arena fell completely silent except for the soft clicking of David's mechanical calculator as it continued processing implications that would reshape the cosmic order forever. The judges looked at each other, and for the first time in their ancient existence, they had no idea what to do next. The final trial never came. Instead, the Tournament of the Gods transformed into something that had never existed before, a gathering where beings of immense power sat in a circle and talked. The arena's competitive structure dissolved, replaced by a simple meeting space where cosmic entities could interact as equals rather than as rivals. David sat with his small mechanical calculator in his lap, still amazed that something he'd built from spare parts and determination had managed to prove that the universe's most powerful beings were fundamentally mistaken about the nature of power itself. Around him, the former competitors were discovering what it meant to question everything they believed about their own existence. "I have consumed entire star systems," the Void Walker said, its constellation form now stable for the first time since David had known it. "But I never understood what I was consuming. I was so focused on the act of destruction that I never learned what made those systems worth preserving in the first place." The World Shaper nodded, its reality-bending abilities now flowing in harmonious patterns rather than the chaotic displays of force from before. "I rebuilt galaxies according to my will, but I never considered whether my will was actually wise. I assumed that having the power to change things meant I knew how they should be changed." The eternal flame burned with a steady, warm light that illuminated the entire gathering. "I have existed since the first stars formed, but I was so concerned with maintaining my eternal nature that I forgot the joy of experiencing new things. True eternity isn't about staying the same forever. It's about having infinite time to grow and learn." The three cosmic judges had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. No longer seated on thrones of crystallized time, they now participated in the discussion as equals, their ancient authority replaced by something more valuable, wisdom earned through honest self-examination. "We ruled through fear," admitted the first judge. "Our subjects obeyed us because they knew we could unmake them with a thought. But fear-based authority is ultimately hollow. It requires constant displays of power to maintain, and it prevents the very growth and understanding that make existence meaningful." The second judge's voice carried notes of wonder that had been absent for eons. "This human has shown us that true power comes not from the ability to force outcomes, but from understanding why those outcomes are desirable in the first place." "We have been cosmic tyrants," said the third judge simply. "Benevolent perhaps, but tyrants nonetheless. We imposed order without explaining why that order was beneficial." David looked around at these beings who had terrified him just days ago. Now they seemed almost fragile, like people who had just discovered that everything they'd built their lives on was an illusion. He felt a responsibility to help them find their way forward. "You're not tyrants," David said gently. "You're just people who got so good at solving problems with power that you forgot there might be better ways. It happens to humans too, just on a smaller scale. But how do we proceed?" asked the World Shaper. "If our authority was based on false assumptions, how do we rebuild cosmic order?" David smiled and held up his calculator. "The same way I solved your tournament challenges. We start by asking better questions." Over the following days, the gathering evolved into something unprecedented. A cosmic university where beings shared knowledge instead of demonstrating dominance. David found himself in the strange position of being humanity's first professor of universal basic principles, teaching concepts that seemed obvious to him but revolutionary to entities who had never needed to consider limitations. "The key," David explained during one session, "is understanding that limitations aren't weaknesses, they're information. When something can't be done a certain way, that tells you something important about how reality works. Instead of trying to overcome the limitation through brute force, you can use that information to find better approaches." The Void Walker had become fascinated with the concept of constructive emptiness, spaces that were empty not because everything had been destroyed, but because they were designed to be filled with something meaningful. The World Shaper began experimenting with collaborative creation, working with existing natural processes instead of overriding them. The Eternal Flame discovered the joy of renewal, learning that true permanence came from constant gentle change, rather than rigid stasis. Most importantly, they all began to teach each other. The cosmic judges shared their deep understanding of universal principles, while the competitors contributed their unique perspectives on existence and purpose. David provided the human viewpoint, the outsider's perspective that asked why. When everyone else took what for granted. As the gathering continued, word spread throughout the galaxy. Other powerful beings began arriving, drawn by rumors of a cosmic revolution that had overthrown the old order of dominance and replaced it with something based on mutual understanding and cooperation. When it came time for David to return to human space, he found himself reluctant to leave. The accidental cosmic university had become something beautiful, a place where beings could grow and learn together instead of competing for supremacy. "You must return to your people," the first judge told him. "They need to know what humanity has contributed to the greater cosmic community." But I'll be back," David said, patting his calculator fondly. "I've got a lot more questions to ask, and I think you folks might have some good answers." The journey home was vastly different from his terrifying fall through the spatial rift. The cosmic beings had learned to work together, creating a gentle transport that carried David back to his mining station with the same care they might use to handle a precious and fragile treasure. When David arrived back at Omega 7, he found that only a few hours had passed in normal spacetime. His supervisor's message asking about the equipment malfunction was still blinking on his communication panel. David smiled and began typing his response. "Minor spatial anomaly resolved," he wrote. "Recommend upgrading our approach to cosmic phenomena. I have some new ideas about how to work with reality instead of against it." As he returned to his routine maintenance work, David could see that his modified scanner was picking up new readings from the asteroid's crystalline structure. The strange minerals that had caused the spatial rift were still there, but now they seemed less chaotic, more purposeful, almost as if they were trying to communicate something. David pulled out his calculator and began running some numbers. If his experience with the cosmic beings had taught him anything, it was that the universe was full of patterns waiting to be understood. And humanity, with their curious nature and willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, might be exactly what the cosmos needed to keep growing and evolving. Somewhere in the depths of space, the Tournament of the Gods had become the Academy of Understanding, and beings who had once competed for dominance now worked together to explore the infinite mysteries of existence. And at the heart of it all was a simple human principle, that true power came not from the ability to impose one's will, but from the wisdom to understand when that will might be wrong and the courage to ask better questions. The universe, David realized, was about to become a much more interesting place.